We bought a van. Yay! Its water pump is leaking. Boo! Let's replace the entire cooling system? Yay? Welcome to the Hippie Geeks. Let's dig in to this project. We bought a 1978 Dodge B200 Sportsman Royal Edition high-top camper van. It is amazing, and we picked it up right before the entire country shut down. Getting it home was an adventure in itself that we will have to talk about sometime, but it has been leaking coolant since we bought it, and it is getting worse. When your water pump starts leaking, it is only a matter of time until it lets go and you find yourself stranded on the side of the road with no coolant. It is best to just replace it, and in our case, we are going to replace the entire cooling system while we are at it. We are putting in a new radiator, water pump, thermostat, heater core, and all of the hoses. That includes the upper and lower radiator hoses, coolant bypass hose, and both heater core hoses. Let's see if we can get this all done in an afternoon. The first thing to do is get the coolant drained out of the system. Now, most radiators, including this one, have a drain on the bottom that you can typically use to drain the system. However, this radiator looks like the original one that came with the van, and its drain is completely seized. The next best thing is to drain the coolant out by pulling the lower radiator hose. However, with this van, the hose is stuck to the outlet and refuses to come loose. Not a problem, I am just going to use a large, plain screwdriver and push it in between the hose and barb, releasing the fluid that way. I could have also just cut the hose, but I am trying to minimize the mess I am making and do not want to get a bunch of coolant on the ground. Animals will sometimes drink coolant as it is sweet and it will kill them. Be a responsible backyard mechanic and make sure to collect all of your fluids and dispose of them properly. Your local parts store will typically recycle them for free, so make sure that it gets there. Once you have as much fluid drained out of the system as you can get, it is time to start disassembly. In some ways, the fact that we are removing everything makes replacing the water pump easier as it is directly behind the radiator. First up is removing the grill. There are usually 5 screws along the top holding it in, but in our B200 they are missing, so all that is left is the 5 screws along the bottom. It helps to use a magnetic tip screwdriver here, as you have to sneak in between the grill and the bumper, and it can be easy to drop the screws into the bumper itself. They should come out fairly easily, and once all of the screws are out, you can almost remove the grill. See those blinkers? Well, you need to unplug them from their wiring harness. They are located in the engine bay directly behind the lights. Once those are disconnected, you can feed the wire harness through and carefully pull the grill away from the van. Set it someplace safe, you don't want to break this thing accidentally. Next up is getting the coolant reservoir out of the way. Ours sits right on top of the radiator, and it has a single hose connecting it to right below the radiator cap. There is a single clamp on the radiator side that needs to be removed, and then 2 bolts that go into the front crossmember. Once those are removed, you can lift the reservoir up and out of the way. Be careful with this though. The reservoir will still have anywhere from a little to a lot of coolant in it, so make sure you are ready to drain it into your bucket once it is out. Now we move on to the hoses. The upper radiator hose is first. There is a clamp on the radiator side and another one on top of the engine where it connects to the thermostat housing. You can typically grab the hose with your hand and twist it loose, but if that doesn't work, a pair of alligator pliers will work wonders. Once that hose was off, I moved on to the heater core hoses. When removing the hoses from the heater core side, have a rag ready as some coolant may leak out. Mine did not, but it can happen. Once that side is off, it is time to get them pulled from the motor side. On the Dodge 318, one comes off of the water pump and the other is on top near the thermostat. They should pull off pretty easily, and if you have a bracket holding them out of the way, make sure to remove it as well so that you can get them out. Not all engines will have a small coolant bypass hose like this one, but we are replacing it as well. One side is on the water pump, and the other goes in under the thermostat. I had to use pliers on that one, but it came off without much of a fight. Now that all of the upper hoses are out, it is time to move under the motor. The clamp on the radiator side was already loosened, as this is where I drain the system, but if you look up into the engine bay, you can see where the other one connects to the bottom of the water pump. This hose absolutely did not want to come loose, and once I got it off, I could see why. The lower barb on the radiator was mangled. Good thing we are replacing it. Next up is disconnecting the fan shroud from the radiator. I forgot to record loosening the nuts, but there are 2 on each side that will need to be removed. Once they are off, you can pull the shroud back towards the motor, over the fan blades, and set it there out of the way. Now it is time to remove the radiator. It has 4 bolts holding it in typically, but a previous owner installed this transmission cooler that connects through a couple of holes in the radiator flanges. Removing them threw me for a bit of a loop as he used 10mm nuts when everything else on this van is Imperial, but eventually I figured it out and removed the 3 nuts that held the cooler in place, leaving it hanging by its top strap. I also decided to unhook the window washing fluid reservoir and shift it out of the way, as it is mounted right next to the radiator. Once that is done, I removed the 2 top bolts that were holding the radiator in place. On this vehicle, and most others, you do not need to remove the bottom bolts, just loosen them as the radiator flange has tabs that sit on top of the bolts. Once I had that down, I decided to remove the bolt holding the oil fill tube in place to give me extra room to move the radiator, as we will need to pull it upwards before setting it down, which is exactly what happens next. Pull the radiator straight up, then tilt the bottom of the radiator towards the motor, then just set it down on the ground. There isn't quite enough room at this point to tip the radiator out from under the van, but that is alright, as the next step will make it work. With the radiator sitting on the ground, that now gives you easy access to the 4 bolts that are holding the fan blades, spacer, and pulley onto the water pump. They should come out fairly easily, but make sure to leave the top one in there to remove last so that you can hold onto the fan blades so that they don't fall on the ground. After that, you can remove the pulley from the water pump and set it aside as well. Now that the fan blades are out of the way, the radiator can be tipped over and pulled out right under the front of the van. Getting the radiator out of the way makes the entire process a lot easier. I also disconnected the last strap holding the transmission cooler in place and set it over to the side to completely open up the front of the engine bay. As you can see in this 1978 Dodge B200, they use several of the water pump bolts to hold both the power steering pump on the right and the alternator on the left in place. I removed the bolts for the power steering pump first, and even though I was expecting it, the heavy little bugger fell down and hung by its hoses. Make sure not to do that. Also make sure to have a catch pan under this area, as liquid will come out from various places during this process. Carefully set the power steering pump back on top of the steering linkage out of the way. Next up is the alternator brackets. First, disconnect your battery cables. No need to fry the system accidentally. Then I just removed the lower bracket entirely, and once unbolted was able to swing the top bracket up and out of the way. After that, I loosened and removed all of the water pump bolts, making sure to know which lengths went to each hole. The shortest bolt is in the top center, the bottom 2 bolts are the next longest, and the 2 outer bolts on either side are the longest ones. While holding on to the lower hose barb, I hit the shaft of the water pump with a rubber mallet, breaking its gasket seal with the motor. This leaves a lot of the gasket in place on the motor, and it all needs to be removed before putting the new water pump on, or you will end up with another leak, which was the whole reason for doing this in the first place. I use a razor blade to scrape it all off, but if you try this, be super careful not to gouge the metal, as again that can lead to a leak. Once I had that whole area cleaned up, it was time to remove and replace the thermostat. It is held in by 2 bolts, which on my motor are pretty obviously not original. Once you are able to remove the housing, pull out the old thermostat and clean the gasket off of both surfaces. Once they are cleaned up, it is time to put the new thermostat in. Grab the housing and put the new thermostat in there point first, followed by the new gasket. Set it back in place, put both of the bolts back in, and tighten them up evenly. We can finally do what triggered this whole process: install a new water pump. Take the water pump and its gasket and put the top bolt through its hole. Slide the whole assembly loosely onto the motor, using the top bolt to hold them in place. You can put the rest of the bolts in place now, carefully putting them through the pump and the gasket, making sure not to tear anything. Once it is all fit back together, you can snug up the top bolt and the bottom left bolt, but not too tight, as you are just holding it in place while you get the alternator and power steering pump remounted. I did the alternator first, hooking the upper bracket back into the 2 bolts on the side of the water pump, along with adding the adjustment bracket back in place. After that, I bolted the power steering pump back in place, but you will notice that I completely forgot to put the double bolt mounting bracket back in. Don't worry, I notice it later when I find the bracket sitting in the parts pile. All of the water pump bolts are snugged down in place now, but not tightened, as this is one of the last things we want to do once we know that everything is in place. I am moving on to the hoses, starting with the coolant bypass hose and getting the 2 heater core hoses attached. I move the sheathing from the old hoses to the new ones, as they do help protect them from vibrations, and then secured them both up and out of the way with the bracket they were in before. Next, I discovered that I completely forgot to install the bracket on the power steering pump, so I got that installed. It can be a bit of a pain to do this. The bolts and spacer have to go in a very specific place, and it really made me work for it. Then again, at least I wasn't replacing it in the snow in a Portland parking lot, which is what I ended up doing when we brought the van home. I finally got it all bolted up and set both belts in place. At this point, you are going to need access to a torque wrench. Set it to 30 pounds of torque and start tightening all of the water pump bolts. Snug them down in an alternating pattern starting at the top as the first bolt, then do the third, then the fifth, then the second, then the fourth, then back to the first. Work that alternating pattern, gradually tightening them until you hit the 30 pounds of torque, which is all you need. Once that is done, you can move on to the next part. Now grab the water pump pulley and set it in place, then put the belt on over the main pulley, alternator, and water pump pulley. At this point, you should grab the fan shroud and set it in place over the pump and pulleys. I forgot and will have to carefully work it in place afterward, which is a pain in the butt. Grab the radiator and tip it back into place before the next step, otherwise you won't have enough room to do it. Put the fan back in place with the spacer and tighten down those 4 bolts. After that, it is time to take the slack out of the belt using the alternator. Either pull on it from the top, or if you are careful, you can use a screwdriver to pry between the bracket and the alternator housing to get it tight, then snug down all of the bolts. Carefully pull the radiator up into place and set the bottom tabs onto the lower bolts that you left in place earlier. Then, put the top bolts back in and tighten them down. Once those are secured, head back underneath and tighten down the lower bolts as well, which finishes securing the radiator in place. Move the fan shroud back where it goes on the radiator and tighten it down as well. Next up, I needed to get the transmission cooler mounted. However, this radiator did not have the same holes in its flange that the older one had. After double checking to make sure there was nothing behind the hole I was about to drill, I put 2 more holes in the flange of the radiator so that I could get the transmission cooler remounted. With that in place, it was time to move on to the upper and lower radiator hoses. They will each get 2 clamps, 1 on each end. Now it is time for the heater core. On most cars, this can be a nightmare. Heater cores are typically buried inside under the dash, but in the 1978 Dodge B200, they kept it in the engine bay in this large plastic box. There are 10 small screws around the top holding the lid on, and they will all need to be removed. There are also 2 nuts on the air box on the left, and then 2 more on the heater fan box that will need to be removed so that you can shift the entire assembly slightly to the right so that you can get the lid open. Once the lid is off, you can see the heater core. It has 2 screws on the bottom holding it in place. Remove those, and you can pull the heater core up and out of the way. Be careful, as it is still full of coolant and will need to be emptied. Now, the heater in this van has never worked right, and I can see why. The adjustment flap is half rusted away. At some point in the past, the heater core had leaked for a long time and the liquid had done a number on the flap. Unfortunately, this is not a part that you can just go out and get, so I am going to have to try to rebuild the one that I pulled out of there. For now though, I am just going to remove it and reassemble everything without the flap. Set the new heater core in place and secure it to the bottom of the box with the 2 screws. Put the lid back in place and put all 10 screws back in. Shift the box over and tighten down the 4 nuts that let you move it out of the way. Attach the hoses to the heater core and tighten down the clamps. My camera died at this point, so we will just move over to security camera footage for the rest. I got the coolant reservoir reinstalled and put a new radiator cap in place. At this point, go back over all of your clamp connections and make sure they are tight. This is where you are most likely to get a leak from. Once the van warms up and the system pressurizes, it is easy for water to get pushed by a loose clamp, and you do not want that. Once you are sure that everything is tight, go ahead and fill the system back up. I am only using water right now, as I plan to flush the system once I have leak tested it, so I will put antifreeze in later. Once the system was full, I hooked the battery back up, then put the grill back in place before starting the van and letting it warm up. Keep an eye on everything, specifically the fluid level in the overflow. While the van is cold, you can open up the radiator cap to see if you need to add a little more, but once it starts to warm up, you are going to want to have that cap closed and in place. Eventually, your thermostat will open up, and you will be able to feel the hot coolant running through the upper radiator hose. It is entirely normal and expected to have air bubbles coming up through the fluid and into the overflow tank. This is actually what you want to see, as you want all of the air to make its way out of the system. Keep an eye on your temperature gauge. If there is an air bubble around the water pump, it can cause no fluid being circulated, which in a worst case scenario can lead to a blown head gasket. Once the van is warmed up and it looks like things have stabilized, go ahead and take it for a test drive. Stop occasionally to check the fluid levels, then get it home, shut it off, and watch underneath for any drips. This is when you will definitely be able to tell if your clamps are tight enough or not. If this is your first time here on the Hippie Geeks, it would be wonderful to have you subscribe. Hopefully, digging into this project with us will help you digging into your projects. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and check out our Patreon page or merch store to support the channel directly. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.